So I'll switch gears a little bit and focus more on behavior as well as on brain structure rather than brain function, which my predecessors did very well. I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. So I'm going to be focusing on fluid intelligence, which I find particularly interesting, and you might ask why, and also what it actually is. So it's generally defined as the ability to reason and problem solve in the absence of concrete knowledge. So it might be a puzzle like you can see in the top right here. I won't quiz you on the right answer, but basically we don't really give people instructions other than pick what you think fits best. And it turns out that a simple task like this is remarkably efficient at predicting a wide range of outcomes, including education, job success, longevity, and mental and physical health. And when we study these types of tasks repeatedly within older people, we find that within subject decline, so people getting a little bit worse, correlates essentially perfectly with the ability to live independently. So the moment people start to lose these types of skills, they often also start to lose the types of skills we value in old age, such as paying your bills and doing your own groceries and the like. It loads quite highly on general intelligence factors, so if you want to do, say, one test instead of a whole standardized intelligence battery, then this would be quite a good bet. It's quite representative for a wide range of skills. And it has remarkable lifespan stability. So there's this beautiful study from Edinburgh, the Lothian birth cohort, which shows that giving people the same type of task across 7, 8, and even 9 decades correlates up to 0.6 or 0.7 across the lifespan. So although there are changes in the absolute performance, the rank order of people stays relatively stable. So for that reason, we find it particularly important to understand how it emerges in childhood and why it changes across the lifespan. So I'm going to focus on 2 aspects of lifespan changes of fluid intelligence. First will be behavior only, trying to come up with some new models of the cognitive dynamics of fluid intelligence. And then I'll switch gears a bit and tell you something about our model we proposed on how to integrate brain structure into our understanding of individual differences in fluid intelligence. So we know that fluid intelligence improves quite rapidly in childhood. And you might ask why. Well, there are a few theories that might help us understand why this happens. So the traditional idea, G factor for general intelligence, proposed originally by Spearman, would tell you something that your general ability or general intelligence increases in childhood. And that's essentially the underlying cognitive tool you use for a wide range of skills. So the reason you get better at fluid intelligence is actually because of your increasing your general abilities. Another way to think of it was proposed by Cattell called investment theory. So he proposed that you invest your abstract reasoning skills to gain knowledge about the world. So essentially these abstract skills are the types of things we use to acquire skills and knowledge about the world, such as geographical knowledge or vocabulary. So if you think of that, and you might plot children who differ a little bit in fluid intelligence early in childhood, and then plot their trajectories in terms of crystallized knowledge about the world, so your vocabulary, your kind of knowledge. Those differences are essentially amplified because a small difference in fluid abilities early on allows you to gain knowledge more rapidly across the lifespan. The final model was proposed by Professor Han van der Maas, and this is borrowed from models from ecological theory, and it's called mutualism. And here, instead of proposing that there's either a kind of a mysterious general ability, as you can see on the left, this G factor, or that there are these 2 skills which behave kind of asymmetrically, but actually all your cognitive abilities interact positively during development. So what does that mean? Well, you might have different skills such as memory and reasoning and vocabulary. And the way to think of them is that actually they help each other grow. So you use your memory to acquire knowledge about the world, and you use your abstract reasoning skills to decompose a complex problem into bits and to then remember how to deal with complex problems. And the nice thing is, or the challenge rather, is that all these 3 models are quite different in terms of their causal hypothesis, but they all explain exactly the same cross-sectional correlation matrix. In other words, if we grabbed a bunch of kids and gave them a bunch of tests, there is no real way to tell apart which one of these theories is more correct, even though they differ a lot in terms of what they mean about the mind, what we can do. However, if we have longitudinal data, we can tease them apart. And I'll give you a brief primer on a particular model that we've been using quite profitably, I think, to understand development over time. And that's called the latent change score model. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about how that works. So say a child or a person scores on a particular cognitive task, Y, at time 1, and then a year or a month or 2 years later they come back and they do the same test again. And we can model by specifying an autoregressive component and setting that to 1, a latent change score factor. So essentially this kind of mean change, or this delta Y, captures the change over time. And the average change over time is just exactly the same as a pair t-test. So if children improve, then the average change will be positive. If older people decline, then the average change will be negative. The nice thing is we specified in this model, in this way, we actually get two parameters for free that I think are quite interesting to understand development. Firstly is what we call self-feedback parameters. So that tells us to what degree does your rate of change in a certain skill, or it could be a brain parameter, depend on where you start. So you often find that people who score very well to start tend to increase a little bit less and vice versa. The second parameter that I think is of considerable importance is the change variance. In other words, does everyone change the same homogeneously, or are there individual differences in how much people improve over time? And this is quite a powerful tool to distinguish various mechanisms. So you might imagine a scenario such as the blue top left, where there's no mean change, but there are differences. Some people improve a lot and other people decrease a lot. You might imagine the more, say, a banal scenario in red, where everyone changes but almost exactly the same. So then there's not that much for us to understand, because there's almost perfect homogeneity in how people change. More realistic scenario would be the top right in purple, where there's a mean change over time, but people differ in how much they change, and there are quite a few people who actually decrease over time. And at the bottom, you see quite common patterns in, say, reading abilities on the bottom left, or in depression interventions. So you often see with depression interventions that people who have the worst mental health score, say right at the bottom, show the greatest benefits from a medical intervention such as medicines or some other type of intervention. Now we're going to take this one step further, and we can say, well, what if instead of understanding one domain of change, we actually measure two different skills? So here we have again our y at time 1 and time 2, and our x at time 1 and time 2. And now we're going to add this extra parameter, because now instead of just the self-feedback parameter in red, so to what extent does change in y depend on where I started in y, we also have these cross-domain coupling parameters in blue. In other words, to what extent does change in one domain depend on where I start in the other? So you might imagine, if I try to understand improvement in the gym, that actually your rate of muscle mass might depend on your stamina at baseline. So why are we jumping through all of these hoops? Firstly, if you want to have a go yourself, we wrote a tutorial paper for people interested in applying these types of models. So if you have multiple ways of any type of data, then we provide some tools to kind of play around with these types of models and see if they might be of use to you. So to use these models, we're going to use data from the NSBN sample, which are about 800 children, young to late adolescents, who were measured on 2 occasions. We're going to focus on 2 domains of intelligence. Firstly, fluid intelligence that we started out with, and secondly, vocabulary. So vocabulary in this particular task includes things such as giving a definition of words or naming pictures displayed in the stimulus book. Now if we go back to our 3 competing models of development again, the first would be the G-factor theory. So here we just say, well, people increase or have this delta G, which basically means the rate of change in your general ability, and that's the reason they improve both in matrix reasoning or fluid intelligence and in vocabulary. The other way to look at this is the idea of investment theory, and I think it's starting a little bit dropped off at the bottom, but the basic idea is, well, we use our abstract reasoning skills, our fluid intelligence, to gain vocabulary knowledge about the world, but conversely, vocabulary doesn't really affect our rate of change in fluid intelligence. And finally, if we think about mutualism, then all your cognitive abilities interact positively during development. So it's not just the case that your fluid intelligence aids your acquisition of vocabulary, it's also the case that your vocabulary aids your rate of change in fluid intelligence. So the nice thing, now that we've translated these mostly verbal models into quantitative models, we can look at this data that we have, this longitudinal data, and we can see, well, which one does the best job at explaining what we find. So we find in this sample of about 800 children that actually the mutualism model performs better than all the other models. It's also slightly more complicated, so it has fewer degrees of freedom. But if we look at the, say, the AIC and the BIC, where the lower number is best, we see that the mutualism model outperforms the other 2 models. In other words, a model that presupposes that vocabulary aids your acquisition of fluid intelligence and vice versa does better than a model such as the G-factor in the investment theory model. If you don't believe me or want to play around, we shared both our data and our analysis script so you can reproduce all our findings on OSF. So I showed you that this mutualism model was the best explanatory model, but we can dig a little bit deeper and see, well, what does that actually mean in terms of parameters? So I'll walk you through the model on the left here. So first we see, well, firstly, reasoning skills, so fluid intelligence at baseline is correlated with vocabulary. Well, that's a pattern you almost always see. That's quite uncontroversial. And secondly, our participants differed in their baseline age, so we regressed that out as a covariance of no interest. So older kids scored a bit better on fluid intelligence and a bit better on vocabulary. Secondly, we find that there are quite large individual differences in growth, so children differed a lot in their rate of improvement in fluid intelligence as well as their rate of improvement in vocabulary. Secondly, we find that the change over time is correlated, so children who make larger gains in vocabulary are on average also those who make larger gains in matrix reasoning skills. We tend to find that within the same domain, children who start out with a high score tend to gain a little bit less. Well, that's not particularly surprising because that will be the children who are almost essentially done developing, so they're kind of reaching their own ceilings, if you will. But most interesting, we find evidence for mutualism, or what we call bivariate dynamic coupling. So what does that mean? It means that a higher starting score in one domain, such as vocabulary, is associated with greater gains in the other, such as reasoning. In other words, not only does your fluid intelligence aid your acquisition of vocabulary, but even stronger so, children with higher vocabularies gain fluid intelligence skills more rapidly over time. There are a lot of possible explanations that we want to explore, but one could be that your vocabulary aids your decomposition of complex problems into parts. So we find if we follow children who are trying to solve one of these abstract puzzles, they actually verbalize what they think the rules are that build up a particular problem. So that might be one way in which a skill such as vocabulary, which sounds less active, if you will, actually helps people deal with complex abstract problems. Now that is one sample, but one nice thing when I gave this talk, a colleague in Oxford, Professor Kate Nation, said, well, actually I have data on exactly these same two tasks in 230 children who are a bit younger, and we have exactly the same measures. So we can again see, does the same model comparison hold? So we did exactly the same procedure. At the top you can see the model comparisons for the NSBN sample, and at the bottom you can see the model comparisons for the Oxford sample. And again, the mutualism model is the most complicated model, but by far outperforms the other two models in terms of prediction. One of the most fascinating things we saw that we predicted in our original paper is that the effects of mutualism, in other words, the effects of vocabulary on intelligence and vice versa, were about twice as strong in these younger children, which makes sense because the 6 to 8-year-olds are improving even more rapidly, so they might benefit even more so. And this actually fits in nicely with a much broader literature on the importance of language skills that acquire a wide variety of cognitive abilities. So now I want to switch gears a little bit. So we focused so far on kind of longitudinal development of cognitive performance, but we also want to understand, well, what are the brain bases of these types of skills? And I'll propose a model that we've been working on both in older people as well as in children called the watershed model. So what is that? This is a project led by my postdoc, Delia Furman. So we take this idea of fluid intelligence, and we were interested in the relationship fluid intelligence has with a wide variety of other constructs, including processing speed or mental speed, white matter integrity, so brain structure, and working memory. So what is the relationship between all these domains? Well, one thing we know is that relationship is there, so I won't bore you with the actual details, but there are literally hundreds of papers that show essentially bivariate correlations between these different constructs. So they're quite tightly related. But in my view, we can keep doing this, and we can keep showing that this correlation is robustly 0.2, 0.3, or whatever it may be. But we want to integrate these findings a bit more. So we took this model called the watershed model. It was originally proposed by Cannon and Keller in 2006, and they used it to explain schizophrenia, but we borrowed it to help us understand fluid intelligence. And they proposed a hierarchical many-to-one cascade of partially independent effects. And that's a long and annoying sentence, so I'll break it apart a little bit. So the basic idea is we can think of the system as a riverbed, if you will, where here 4 is the kind of mouth of the river, is the complex phenotypical outcome. So in their explanation, that was the kind of the degree of schizophrenia a person displayed. And the idea is that if we go up the river, there are several partially independent rivers of endophenotypes that affect the ultimate outcome. So this could be, for instance, the fact that people with schizophrenia often have working memory deficits. And working memory deficits are not necessarily specific to schizophrenia, but they're quite often observed. And we can then take a particular endophenotype, such as working memory deficits, and then say, well, what is the underlying mechanism that causes those differences in working memory capacity? That would be the lower endophenotype. So essentially, that would be the kind of the 2s here in this model, which are the intermediate manifestation of kind of the problems here. And then all the way right up at the tip of the river are the 1s, and those are the small genetic effects. And the idea is if I take such as something, for instance, such as working memory deficits here, like the river arm 3, the idea is, well, there might be hundreds and hundreds of small genetic effects which affect the brain structure, which affect working memory capacity, which ultimately are one of many causes that lead to a person displaying a particular degree of schizophrenia. Why is this useful? Well, it explains a few phenomena in the literature that would otherwise be quite puzzling. One would be that even though things such as schizophrenia or fluid intelligence aren't very highly heritable, we tend to not really find reliable genes for schizophrenia. If anything, we find hundreds, if not thousands, of small genetic effects. Now, that doesn't really make sense if you think of something like schizophrenia in the same way you think about measles or Huntington's, but there's a single underlying cause. But if you think of it as the outcome of this kind of complex system, then it exactly fits, because there are actually many hundreds or thousands of genetic effects that contribute to this kind of complex multivariate outcome. So it helps us explain why trying to find the gene for schizophrenia hasn't really worked. It also helps us explain why people with brain lesions often have these kind of partial specific deficits rather than global deficits. It helps us explain phenotypic heterogeneity in power. So, for instance, the hunt for genes for depression has been not particularly successful. And that kind of, again, makes sense if you think of this system as, say, depression as the outcome. Because actually there might be many different constellations that lead to a similar level of depression, but actually have quite different underlying biological phenotypes. Why is this important? Well, we can use this type of thinking to move towards an integrative cognitive neuroscience. So rather than pick individual pairs of associations, try to see, well, how can we build all this knowledge together into a single model and maybe extend it ultimately? It might help us to increase power. So instead of trying to find the genes for schizophrenia, we might take a particular symptom of schizophrenia and try to find for genes that explain differences in that particular symptom, rather than go all the way from this complex outcome all the way back to these small genetic effects. So the statistical implications are that essentially all effects flow through these intermediate phenotypes, that they display this phenomenon called multiple realizability. So there's essentially multiple different ways to reach the same outcome. So two people might score the same on some continuous measure of schizophrenia or on some continuous measure of fluid intelligence for quite different reasons, for a different underlying constellation of biological factors. So what we want to do now is take the same way of thinking about schizophrenia and translate it to this marker of fluid intelligence and to see if we can use that to get some traction on understanding it. So the hypothesis that we want to test is that fluid intelligence is affected, in this case, by processing speed and working memory. So those are these underlying building blocks that are necessary for fluid intelligence, which are in turn affected by white matter integrity, and not by white matter integrity as a global measure, but actually that different white matter tracts play partially complementary roles. In other words, if I take a summary of all your white matter tracts into a single number, then I'm missing out something, because two people might achieve the same level of fluid intelligence for different reasons. So which data do we use? I'm going to use the CALM data, which is a cohort that we're working on here in Cambridge, which is started by Professor Sue Gathercole and is currently led by Dr. Joni Holmes. It's currently 800 children between 5 and 17, and they're recruited as having any challenges with attention, learning, or memory. And the rationale is that we wanted to understand poor cognitive performance across the board rather than stratify either by typical controls or by particular diagnosis. So some of the future plans we want to develop is to include typical controls, a second wave, and make all the data available. So on the bottom right here is our aging cohort, which is publicly available, and I think about 600 groups across the world have downloaded our T1, T2, and diffusion weighted imaging in this large sample, and ultimately we want to do the same for this cohort. So if you're interested in this data, you can access it. We also included a replication sample because we wanted to know that whatever findings we established in the CALM sample weren't unique to our particular cohort. So for that, we used this rather nice publicly available data set called the NKR Rockland sample. It has not exactly the same, but quite similar measures, slightly different age distribution, but more or less in the same ballpark. So we wanted to see whether whatever effects we observed, whether they generalized across these two cohorts. So in terms of the cognitive data, we have measures of working memory, fluid intelligence, and processing speed. I won't go into the detail for interest of time, but you can see them here on the left in the CALM sample and on the right in the Rockland sample. And for the neural data, we focus on fractional anisotropy. So that's an indirect index of white matter microstructure. And we focus on the JHU atlas, which gives us these 10 kind of canonical tracts, including the forceps minor and the cingulate gyrus, that capture the kind of the chunky parts of the white matter atlas. And you can see the kind of age-related differences in change, or differences in fractional anisotropy in the two samples, COM and the NKI Rockland sample. So what does this watershed model look like? So again, you could think of the top of this figure here as being the mouth of the river. And we're trying to model the kind of building blocks that lead to individual differences in fluid intelligence. So what do we find? Well, the hypothesis is that the white matter, so the tracts at the bottom, affect working memory and processing speed, which in turn affect fluid intelligence. That's exactly what we found. We find here that actually many more than one particular tract plays a role in both working memory and speed. So if I want to understand individual differences in working memory, I need to understand both white matter integrity, or in the SLF, in the forceps major, and in the cingulum. And for processing speed, it was a different constellation of tracts. So there seems to be this cognitive specificity in the mapping between brain and behavior. In turn, these two constructs here in working memory and speed contributed to individual differences in fluid intelligence, and these effects were all quite large. So white matter integrity explained 32% of the variance in working memory and 38% in speed, and together they explain more than half of the individual differences in fluid intelligence. So these white matter effects are specific, complementary, and strong, and overall this model fit well, which meant we didn't need to allow for any direct effects of white matter onto fluid intelligence. Rather, they all flowed through working memory and processing speed, which we hypothesize are among two of the building blocks one needs to perform these fluid intelligence tasks well. So what do we find in the NKI Rockland sample? So that's our replication sample. We find quite similar effects. Again, we find this many-to-one mapping of white matter tracts onto working memory and speed, which in turn affected fluid intelligence and explained almost 80% of the variance. Should note the effects are a bit less pronounced here because this sample is far smaller in terms of the DTI data they have. But again, we find this notion that white matter effects are specific, complementary, and strong, and that we can think of this as a hierarchical system. So the final replication is in our CAN sample. That's the data I showed you before. So that's our 18 to 88 healthy aging sample. And here we focus only on processing speed. We didn't have a measure of working memory here. But again, we find this pattern that these white matter integrity in these tracts contributes to individual differences in processing speed, which in turn explain almost 60% of the variance in fluid intelligence. So white matter contributes to these lower cognitive building blocks, which in turn allow you to build up this complex skill of fluid intelligence. So to conclude, this watershed model replicates across cohorts and across the lifespan. So to summarize the findings I showed you today, the development of fluid intelligence at the behavioral level is a dynamic process. We find that fluid intelligence shows these reciprocal, mutually beneficial interactions with vocabulary and likely also with other skills. When we move one explanatory level down to include brain structure, we find that the neural mechanisms underlying these abilities are multifaceted and hierarchical. And to understand the relationship between brain and behavior, one has to accommodate this inherent complexity in these systems. So where do we want to go from here? Well, one thing I'm particularly interested in is to expand this temporal resolution of change even further. So we go from the traditional perspective of studying individual differences in cognitive performance to the data I showed you initially, which is to follow children or adults over time as they change. But I want to zoom in even further. I want to look at very high temporal resolution, temporal fluctuations in performance. So how do people vary across minutes, across hours, and across the day? Because those are the types of things that matter for our performance at work, our performance in the educational system, etc. I want to see if we can bridge the gap between these brain structure measures, which don't really change across the day, to see if there are functional brain markers that are manifestations of brain structure. In other words, things such as maybe MEG or EEG indexed response time lags. So essentially, are there aspects of brain function which are a manifestation of differences in brain structure, so we can again build up this hierarchy. And finally, I want to expand essentially those two types of things, or the two types of projects I've shown you today, to study longitudinal brain behavior interactions. So if I know your brain structure now, do I know something about your likely rate of improvement in cognitive ability over time? And to do that, I'll be looking at the large ABCD sample. We just started measuring the second wave in our large PAMCAN sample, and I have a collaboration with the HUBU sample, which is a remarkable childhood sample which has scanned children, I think, 13 times now, every 6 months. So increasingly, the kind of thing the field is moving towards understanding development as it happens over time. With that, I'd like to thank the funders, the lab members, and my mascots. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.